Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. We have a lot of people joining. Welcome again, everyone, to Forests Are the Future, a case study in stopping deforestation. I'm Emily Selzer, RAND's Individual Giving Director, and I'm really excited for today's conversation. Just a bit of housekeeping first. We will be doing a Q&A at the end, so if any questions come up for you during the presentation, you can drop them in the Q&A box. Also, keep your eye on the chat. I know one of my colleagues is going to be dropping some resources there throughout the program. So, next slide, please. Thank you. If you're here today, you probably already know how important forests are. We often say that forests are the future because protecting the world's forest is key to regulating our climate and maintaining a livable planet. In fact, protecting the rainforest in the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Indonesia ensures that we have access to clean air, water, and food in our own communities. Tropical forests are responsible for pulling massive amounts of carbon from the air, where they then store it, all the while putting off oxygen. They're also home to more than half the world's plant and animal species, critical biodiversity, which is essential for global health and stability. For over 40 years, RAN has been working to protect the world's forest from the corporations destroying them to make cheap snack foods, beauty products, and cleaning supplies. Today, you're going to hear from some of my colleagues that are leading on our Keep Forests Standing campaign, which focuses on pushing some of the world's biggest and most influential brands and banks to respect community rights and stop financing forest destruction. They're going to talk about how we use research to identify the companies causing forest destruction, push them to adopt policies that protect the forests and the people that live there, and how we hold them accountable to their commitments. Plus, they'll share how movement from massive brands like PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, and Mondelez has the power to shift the entire snack food industry. Thank you again so much for joining us today and for all your support of Rainforest Action Network. This work that we do really wouldn't be possible without you all. Now, I'm so pleased to hand it over to my colleague Danielle Carrillo, RAND's Forest Campaign Director. Danielle?
Thanks, Emily. Hey, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm the Forest Campaign Director. I'm part of RAND's Forest Program, which focuses on keeping the rainforest standing in the Amazon, Congo Basin, and Indonesia by targeting the financial institutions and the companies that are driving deforestation. And I'm responsible for the Keep Forests Standing campaign. And that campaign looks at what companies are driving deforestation and rights violations. We look at the producers who destroy the rainforest and replace them with palm oil plantations. We look at the traders who sell palm oil, pulp, and beef. And finally, the consumer good companies that rely on these ingredients for their products like cookies, shampoo, detergent, pet food. And this chain of destruction, it generates huge profits for these companies at the cost of rainforest and people. And that's where we come in. A lot of folks would say, well, what do you do against corporations that are so big that are attacking this? And at RAN, we've got a motto. We say we stand up, we fight back, we challenge corporate power, and we expose these companies by investigating their supply chains, linking them to deforestation and rights violations. We engage with their sustainability and human rights teams to get them to adopt and implement policies. We launch strategic campaigns where we carry out activities to pressure them at their headquarters, where their CEO speaks. And when the company stalls and is not making any progress, we escalate. And at the center of this model is people. We form strong partnerships with the communities on the ground who are directly impacted by the deforestation happening, who are facing retaliation for standing up for their rights. We bring their voices into the boardroom of companies, and we show up to pressure these companies. And those actions depend on supporters like yourselves. And many of you have already joined us signing petitions, joined us in the streets on actions against some of these companies. And thanks to your support in those actions, we're able to win. And an example of a victory, we can go back a few years to the PepsiCo campaign, which was a part of our Snack Food 20 campaign. When we launched it, PepsiCo was at the bottom among its peers for not addressing deforestation and rights violations in its supply chain. But thanks to people power, thanks to groundbreaking investigations, the campaign won important victories like protections of the lobster ecosystem, like addressing labor rights violations in the palm oil industry. And we took those learnings from that campaign and applied them to our new campaign, the Keep Forests Standing campaign, which is our current work. And to hear more about our current work, I want to invite my colleague Pete Cooper to share more about the Keep Forests Standing campaign.
Hi everyone, my name's Pete Cooper. I work as a corporate negotiator on RAND's Keep Forests Standing campaign. And I think, over the past decade, we've seen really a fundamental shift across the sector. Whereas, 10 to 15 years ago, most large consumer brands had minimal or no meaningful commitments on deforestation. And, expectations were limited, where companies were generally only responding to issues in their supply chain when they were exposed, rather than putting systems in place to prevent those issues from occurring in the first place. And today, that landscape looks very different. So across most major brands, commitments to no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation, or NDPE, have become, fairly widespread, and those have been cascaded up brand supply chains as well, to a point where NDPE now is becoming the baseline expectation for any company involved in a forest risk supply chain. And at its core, NDPE is a commitment to remove deforestation, peatland conversion, and exploitation, which means human rights abuse, from supply chains. And while that headline commitment is relatively straightforward, the issues behind it are a lot more complex. So at RAN, we've developed a methodology for assessing those companies' policy commitments and implementation, with a set of key indicators that look at the strength and the scope of those policies, the level of transparency that a company provides, whether they have monitoring and due diligence systems, the effectiveness of grievance mechanisms, and also whether companies are using their influence through advocacy. Taken together, that gives us a holistic view of whether companies are able to actually identify and respond to issues within their supply chain, and take actions to prevent those from reoccurring, or whether those policy commitments are sort of empty corporate statements that, sit on a dark corner of a website and gather dust. And I guess that's really where we see the core problem in the sector today, where the challenge is no longer securing commitments. It's about ensuring that those commitments function in practice. So policies exist, but they're not applied equally. Even within a single large brand may be exposed to, multiple different forest risk commodities and apply their NDPE policy suite effectively across one, but fail to do so across another. So that allows bad actors to continue to operate. Transparency itself is also very partial. So companies may disclose some, but not enough information for us to make a meaningful assessment. And then some actors continue to operate outside of visible systems entirely. So they may sell into markets with less scrutiny. Or increasingly, something we're seeing as well is bad actors at the production end of the supply chain developing very complicated corporate structures, where they'll have a sort of a clean face to the business that will interact with their customers and the brands, and then off the books or shadow companies that continue to deforest and commit human rights abuse. So the question for us has shifted. It's no longer, does a company have a policy? It is, how is that policy functioning in practice? And that's where our Keep Forests Standing Scorecard comes into play. And we assess some of the largest brands on the planet, focusing specifically on whether those commitments are functioning in practice. And what this allows us to do is to publicly compare companies. So we're able to shame those companies that are lagging behind their peers. It also allows us to track their progress over time. And crucially, too, it also helps to inform where we need public pressure to force change. And I think, excuse me, it's important to look at not just how change is affected at the consumer brands sort of end of the supply chain, but also how change is happening on the ground. And one of the most consistent findings across forested regions is that land rights are foundational to forest protection. So where Indigenous peoples and local communities have secure tenure, which means that their rights to land are both recognized but also enforceable. In that situation, deforestation rates are lower. And that's because those communities have both the capacity and also the incentive to keep forests standing in the long term. They're present on the ground, they understand the landscape, and they're affected directly by changes to it. So within an NDPE system, they also play a really crucial role as an early warning system because often local communities are the first to identify and raise the alarm about deforestation. However, despite that, we're seeing quite an alarming shift in the sector, where brands are continuing to develop and strengthen policies around deforestation, but weakening or entirely removing their policies as they relate to land rights and human rights. And in other words, the social dimension of these frameworks is not keeping pace with the environmental. So it ran a core demand when we're interacting with these corporations is around the protections that they should be putting in place for human rights defenders. Human rights defenders are those individuals within those communities who are standing up against and challenging land grabbing and deforestation. And so they're really central to where the systems of accountability function in practice. However, they're facing a completely unacceptable wave of violence. So, for example, between 2015 and 2024, there are over 6,400 attacks recorded globally towards defenders. So that's two attacks every day for nearly a decade. Within those numbers, over 1,000 human rights defenders were killed as well. So that's a rate of one person murdered every 3 days for defending their community. Indigenous peoples have also borne an overwhelmingly share of this violence as well too. So Indigenous people represent about 6% of the world's population. During that same period, they suffered around 21% of all recorded attacks. And there were actually figures released yesterday that suggest that figure rose to 30% in 2025. So there's a clear contradiction at the center of the system where the people who are most critical to protecting forests are also amongst those who are facing the highest levels of risk. And that's why when we're speaking to these large corporations, protections for human rights defenders are the center of our command, particularly with our work through the Zero Tolerance Initiative, of which RAN is a founding member. And ZTI sets out a very clear expectation that companies move away from sort of broad and generalized human rights statement and into very specific and very enforceable protections for defenders through their own policies, through making these contractual requirements to suppliers, and ensuring that there are accessible and effective mechanisms by which by which people can be raising concerns. And really, without these protections, the systems of accountability in the NDPE do not function in practice. And that, I guess, brings us back to my central point in that, the sector has made real progress in terms of commitments. But the next phase and really the crucial challenge for RAN's campaign is ensuring that these commitments are translated into systems that actually work, both for forests and also for the people that are protecting them. I'll pass back to you, Danielle.
Thanks, Pete. So again, the motto of RAN is to move a sector. So we're not focused on just one company, but we look at a whole sector. And in this example, consumer good companies. And our theory of change is you don't move a sector by targeting those who are already leading the way with strong commitments or are in the middle. You have to raise the floor. And by doing that, you have to actually go after the worst actors. Because when we move those worst actors, there's a domino effect, and the other companies move as well. And we're raising that benchmark, that floor for all the companies above. And we also build on our past campaigns. Our Snack Food 20 campaign that worked to actually move the needle on palm oil, and we established strong benchmarks for palm oil NDPE commitments. That was one of the key victories in the Pepsi campaign. They adopted strong NDPE commitments and had strong human rights protections as well. And what we saw afterwards was that other companies also proceeded to do the same in their palm oil policies. Our current campaign looks at that benchmark of palm oil and actually applies it to the other forest risk commodities like soy, pulp, and paper to do the same process of also raising the floor on that standards for those forest risk commodities. And that brings us to Mondelez. So in our Keep Forests Standing campaign, Mondelez is the only company that has an F. And what does that mean? What does it mean to score an F? In Mondelez's case, it means that they don't have protections for environmental and land defenders. It means they're not taking action when their supply chain is linked to deforestation. It means they're not being transparent about where their ingredients are coming from and who they're buying from. It means they're advocating against regulations that would protect forests, like the EUDR. So for the past year, they've been the main target of our campaign. And we can go to the next slide. And we've been pressuring them inside and outside. And when I say inside, we've been in the boardrooms engaging with their sustainability and human rights team to get them to adopt new policies. We've been in the streets, as you can see, the pictures in this slide showing up outside retail locations, outside their offices, bakeries, disrupting company events, delivering petitions. And many of you on this call signed some of those petitions and that we delivered to them. And we can go to the next slide. And they're actually our second target for the Keep Forest Standing campaign. When we launched the campaign, Procter and Gamble was actually at the bottom with an F. And again, the strategy of RAN is to move the sector, and we move them by ranking them and then identifying who are the worst actors, who are the ones scoring an F in our evaluation, and moving them. And a lot of times that means going after companies that other groups would say there's no way you can move them. How can an NGO like RAN move a multi-billion-dollar company? But for the past 40 years, we've been bold, we've been fearless, and we've taken on the worst of the worst. And that's because we know what's on the line. Rainforests are disappearing, environmental activists are being killed, indigenous land is being stolen. And to make it a real impact, you have to go after the worst actors and find a way to win. And our recent effort against P&G illustrates that. A campaign that lasted 4 years. We published groundbreaking investigations connecting P&G's supply chain to land rights violations, connecting their supply chain to deforestation. We carried out powerful campaign activities like banner drops from bridges, closures of their headquarters, disrupted speaking engagements of their CEO. And after 4 years of consistent pressure, they came to the table And to move out of the bottom of the pack, they took action. They took action on some of the land rights violations in their supply chain. They improved some policies to protect human rights defenders. And as you can see, the work takes time. Right? It takes years. We don't go in expecting that within a week we're going to win a campaign. Because to really move the companies, we've got our motto of investigations, of the insider engagement, of the outside pressure and the partnerships. And as I was saying, the our main ingredient for all that is people power. And I just want to take an opportunity to say thank you for joining us in those actions and being courageous and bold in signing those petitions and coming out in the streets and resourcing this campaign. Without supporters like yourself, none of this work would be possible. So with that, I'll hand it back to my colleague Emily.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pete and Danielle, for that really informative overview. We are going to move into the Q&A portion right now. So if you have questions, I know there's some coming in through the chat. Feel free to also use the Q&A box. And would love to ask the panelists to come back on and introduce also my colleague Zan Garland, who's going to help me facilitate the Q&A. Zan, do you want to take the first question?
Yes, thanks so much, Emily, and thank you, Danielle and Pete. That was a great overview. Our first question today kind of comes from some of the signs that we were seeing throughout the presentation about human rights defenders. And Pete, I was just wondering if you could explain what a human rights defender is and what a human rights defender policy is for the audience. Thanks.
Yeah, so that phrase, human rights defender, is one that was coined by the UN. And the definition is basically any individual person who is peacefully standing up for human rights. So that can be an indigenous leader, a community member, it can be a member of civil society, a lawyer, journalist, or a trade unionist. Within a forest risk commodity supply chain, typically those are defenders are frontline community members who are challenging deforestation and rights abuse. And they face a huge amount of risk, threats towards themselves, towards their families and communities, violence and intimidation. Often they're facing criminalization and as I spoke about, the threat of death as well too. So a functioning defender policy at a corporate brand level is about enforceability and accountability. It's about saying that any violence or threats of intimidation towards defenders in a supply chain will not be tolerated. And it's about not just making that statement, but it's about systems that make that possible. So it's about contractual requirements and it's about providing mechanisms to get that communication back up from the ground. And it's about saying that, this isn't just the cost of doing business, that these are real people and violence towards them will not be tolerated.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so important. We have another question here, wondering what the status of the integrity of the RSPO is. Danielle, or do you want to take that one, or either of you is fine, but also maybe just quickly, just an explanation on what the RSPO is for our audience.
Yeah, sure. So it's been a benchmark, and RAN has some history in helping to establish the RSPO, the sort of baseline certification for palm oil. But it has been weakened over the years by company interest, and it's no longer a standard that we hold companies to in terms to actually verify that the palm oil they use in their ingredients is deforestation free, is free from rights. Um, so to that piece, that's we're not asking companies make sure your RSPO certified. We're asking them to actually have stronger commitments there. And if Pete, you want to add anything, feel free.
Thank you, Danielle. Um, and this is kind of a two-part question. Folks in the Q&A box and in the chat are wondering what individuals can do and also whether boycotts are effective. Some folks have been boycotting Mondelez for years. Is boycotting something we promote? And what else can individuals do? And what kind of impact does that have? Danielle, do you want to start or Pete?
Yeah, we typically don't promote boycotts. Certainly, the scale of these corporations is huge. Mondelez, whom Danielle was speaking about earlier, I think their revenue last year was 38.5 billion. So for us to organize a boycott of that scale is beyond the resources that we have. And also, like the palm oil was in everything. So, shifting our shopping habits from one company to another is not necessarily addressing the problem. But I think as we saw in Danielle's presentation, these companies do and will respond to public pressure. So really what we'd encourage people to do is to communicate back to the companies the fact that they need to clean up their supply chains. And you can do that individually, you can do that by joining RAN in person at a public protest, or there's also a number of actions that you can take through our website. Also, our donors are vitally important. They're the people who keep us doing what we're doing. They allow us to provide resources to communities and civil society on ground, and to bring those voices into boardrooms. I also want to really thank everyone who's supporting our work. But corporations have these companies are huge and they have a large amount of power. But they will listen and they will respond to groups of people working together.
And I just jump in and say, you're probably on our email list already, but if you're not following us on Instagram or Facebook, please do so as well, as those are also places where we put out calls to action and ways people can participate.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that came up a couple times in the chat in the Q&A box, including right now, or just now, is how RAN works with other organizations like Amazon Watch or within coalitions to make our work effective. Do you want to take that, Danielle?
Yeah, RAN is a member of various coalitions like the Forest and Finance Coalition, the Zero Tolerance Initiative, which are, just to name two examples of alliances we're a part of that are global and have groups like Amazon Watch, and I think I saw in the chat also like Human Rights Watch, and a lot of the other groups that people might be familiar with, and we collaborate with them on investigations, on actions, where appropriate on our campaigns. Because like we said, partnerships are a key part of our work, and we can't do this on ourselves.
Thanks so much. There's a question about kind of the criminal activities happening in places like the Amazon and whether those are enabled or funded by corporations. Um, I think folks are seeing a lot of the violence that's happening in criminalization of components of this and just wondering about kind of how that's connected to what corporations are doing around the world.
I mean, on criminal activity or illegal activity, I mean, we laid out the different types of violations that we document, right? And Pete was sort of laying out the impacts on actual people who stand up and voice and say no when the bulldozers are coming to take their houses. So there are ways that different actors play in that, and one can also argue, by not doing anything, you're allowing that to happen, and those are some of the things that we do through our campaigns. That you can't be an innocent bystander or be neutral in situations like this when at the end of the day you're making money from that.
Yeah, and I think too, different places have different levels of governance, and if you're in a community facing land grabs and deforestation in an area with a lot of corruption, one of the risks that you see is when you're trying to get assistance from the police. They may actually come and you find yourself and community members are the ones that are being arrested, rather than those that are stealing land or illegally cutting trees down.
Another question that's come up is around how RAN engages with these corporations. What is our method for pressuring them directly? And then how does that interact with some of like the external pressure?
I think we don't expect companies just to make things better out of the goodness of their hearts. It requires public pressure. And we take a very focused approach too, where typically we will focus our energies on the worst of the companies that we're targeting. And really, we use a variety of different techniques to build that pressure to a moment that we can bring into the boardroom. So that can range from online petitions through to protests at headquarters. We do what we call bird dogging, where we'll track where CEOs are going to be and disrupt events, and really look at anything creative that we can do to get our foot in the door. And then we switch a lot to what Danielle sort of referred to as our inside campaigning, where we're also there and shirt and tie and in the boardrooms, and bringing demands and bringing voices from frontline communities to the decision makers within the corporate structure.
Thank you. There's a great question here about kind of the demand for palm oil, and just wondering whether the elimination of hydrogenated fats in consumer products had the unintended consequence of palm oil demand, or if you all have any other sense of what has driven palm oil demand.
I don't think I can answer whether it was the elimination of fats that drove it, but a big factor is that it's an incredibly fast growing crop, and one with a really, really high yield. So it's a really effective ingredient. And I want to make the point that, RAN is not anti-palm oil. The issue is the rapid and industrial scale of the expansion that we've seen in the industry, and the effect that that's had on forests and on communities. But we're not against palm oil per se. It's the inappropriate way in which the industry has expanded.
Thanks. There's a question on whether we've considered advocating for cellular agriculture as a way to both stop deforestation, but also enable more reforestation.
Let's see. We, I guess on the question of how we're stopping deforestation, enabling reforestation, I would say it's less on cellular agriculture or promoting different ways like that. The example that we shared about like the LOSER ecosystem, we ask companies to invest in programs to help keep those forests standing. We ask companies to do the same in different landscapes that are at risk of being destroyed and have indigenous peoples in there. Those are ways and part of the actions that we demand from companies on grievances on land rights or deforestations is remedy, and that's a key part of our campaign.
Thank you. Um, we are getting a lot of questions, and just want you all to know that we will follow up with these. We'll save the questions if we don't get to all of them, because we may not. There are so many good ones. But I think one of the last questions we're going to ask is about the role of the United Nations. I think, one thing people might not know about are things like the COP on biodiversity and COP 30 on Belém and how they connect to our work and what the connection is between corporations and government and UN. I know that's kind of a huge question, but maybe you could answer it like relatively briefly of kind of how we intersect with all of those places and entities.
Yeah, I think the challenge is answering that one briefly. Yeah, we do work in the UN space as well too. I've spoke a bit about human rights defenders, and that definition comes from the UN and the work that was done there. The UN has also published guidance for how businesses should be protecting human rights defenders. So that's something that we then take from the UN level into individual businesses, and use that as really sort of saying this is the base expectation for you. We will also attend various UN events, and be looking to influence a variety of different either state or corporate actors there.
Excellent. Thank you. I do think that's all the time we have for today. But thank you all so much for joining us and for participating. As Zan said, we have received so many great questions in the chat. So we'll definitely follow up with you with additional information, and we'll send this recording around. Also, thank you to Pete and Danielle for sharing your wisdom with us today. And yeah, we hope you'll follow us on email and the socials and come to our next presentation. Thank you all so much.